We'll bring the special meeting of the Public Safety and Crime Prevention Policy and Finance Committee to order and start out with the roll call.
Cornish.
Here.
Woodard.
Here.
Mullery.
Here.
Gothier.
Here.
Grunhagen. Johnson.
Here.
Kiefer. Kriesel.
Present.
Leidiger. McDonald. Nornis. Smith.
Okay, we don't have any minutes to approve. Just so you folks know what's going on here for everybody in the media audience as well as here, I think everybody by this time knows the reason we're here. We're to have a hearing and go over the process and interview the Commissioner of Corrections, Mr. Roy, and to see what the standards for release are and vet the process out for release of prisoners on parole and what's taken place over the years, and go over everything in detail. One thing I want to make sure that everybody knows here, that this is not an inquisition, this is an inquiry, and it is not a witch hunt. It is a vetting of the process. We're here to get the facts, what happened, what's going to happen in the future, how this came to be, and it's going to be rather informal. I want to announce that if there's anybody that would like to speak, let us know in the end after. We're going to go through and take care of everybody that has signed up or that we've invited, but it'll be an open process. Anybody at all that wants to talk can. And with that, Commissioner Roy, are you here? You can approach the table if you would. And also for the people here in the viewing public, this is like I say, not a witch hunt or here to throw eggs at the commissioner. It's just to ask questions about what he's done. We have a good relationship with this commissioner in the past, and I think I want to put words in his mouth, but I don't think we've been too hard on him. We've conferred back and forth about various items, but we're here today to talk about a serious subject. Commissioner, before I get into this, naturally, you would probably know in my field that I wasn't actually happy with your decision, and but it's not just me personally, it's a lot of cops. You heard some of it come out, and then it's not just about the person with the cops, but it's about the gangster also, the gang member, and others, the 4, I believe, and the 150 pending. And there's a lot of concern basically because it seemed like even the media didn't know about it. It was a surprise to everyone, and all of a sudden we were confronted with it. And a lot of confusion, probably how the process worked in the past, how it's changed, the criteria is used, the public meeting, the contacts with the victims. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak first, and we're not going to put any time limit on you, and explain how the process worked with you, what came into your decision, and how you figure this works from start to finish. And you can get as much detail as you'd like, and then when you're done, we'll probably have numerous questions for you. So, Commissioner, go ahead. Good to have you here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. It is, I can't say it's a pleasure to be here talking to you this morning, but it is certainly important that I am here. This subject area is one that is so important to the state and to you folks that it really needs a rational discussion. The last place that a subject matter like this should be discussed and should be focused around is in the media. This area of criminal justice is so complex. It has so many ramifications into the future. It is so important to victims. It is so important to the character of our justice system that we really need to talk about it in a rational, informed way. And I really thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell you about this important and difficult work that we do every day in the Department of Corrections. I've prepared a statement, and I'm going to, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I'd like to, and it might answer and some of the questions you have, and it might stimulate some questions perhaps from you as well. And I know there are at least a couple people in this room that may want to address you as well. So I will be as concise and as accurate as I possibly can be. And believe me, this is an area that we have focused on significantly for the past couple of weeks, of course. But I'll tell you, from the moment I became commissioner 9 months ago, this process and the importance of this process has been something that has been keen to me, and it is, I believe, the heaviest work that I do as commissioner. Your letter to Governor Dayton last week pointed out that the parole of Timothy Eling and John Scruggs have caused you to wonder about our parole system. As I have said, considering parole for a person who has taken the life of another, especially a public servant, is of concern to us. And our premise from the very beginning on these cases is that there is no state-imposed sanction that can equal the loss and harm that's been done to the victims and the victim's family. We recognize that. And that victim loss is certainly something that we focus on during every hearing. It is something that is prevalent in all of our discussions. And in the Department of Corrections, we go to great lengths to engage victims in all of these discussions with our special victims advocate. We are proud of that work, and we believe that there is nothing that has gone to victims that is inaccurate. They are well informed, and too often the pain of the original offense is something that they experience at these hearings. It is, these hearings are dark. They are dark days in my life. There are dark days in the staff that help me in making these decisions. And we take it very, very seriously. In all cases involving murder, the attention given to a victims is utmost and foremost in our considerations. Let me add to that. The issue of victim impact and the appropriateness of sentence has certainly come to light in the past week or so. To a large degree, and we believe that the legislature set the tone for the sanctions of murder, and the sentencing judge in their role carried out their appropriate role in providing for a life sentence. During the parole process, a commissioner does not have the legal authority to impose amounts to a life sentence. That is clearly established in statute, and that is clearly the role of the judge to impose sentence. I must follow the statute that was in place at the time when these individuals, and more than these specific individuals, when they were sentenced. Timothy Eling is included in a group of 150 commonly called lifers who were sentenced before August 1st, 1989. Prior to that date, offenders sentenced to life imprisonment were required to serve 17 years before being eligible for parole. At the time that that statute was formed, there was no distinction between murder victims based on employment status, whether they were teachers, mothers, wives, public servants. There was no distinction. Those people that were sentenced at that time received the maximum life with eligibility for parole at 17 years. This life sentence review process, when it begins, can span many years, and it can often span the administrations of several commissioners. It is not a decision that is arrived at in a month's time or 6 months' time or a year's time. These decisions and these processes can take years and years and years. And the notion behind that is it is so serious a decision, and we got to get it right, that you don't form a good analysis of the case, you don't form a good analysis of the character of the offender, in a period of months. That often takes years. And that is really what we are facing right now, in that we have many, many of these 150 offenders who have done considerable time over the 17-year minimum. In the case of Eling, my predecessor commissioner reviewed this case in 2006 and found that he had made significant progress since his last parole hearing. And she set the stage for his reclassification and transfer to a medium security classification and a medium security facility. In that interim process, however, this offender received or encountered serious medical condition that required treatment over the course of many, many months, and it was felt that his stay in Stillwater in a close supervision facility was the best place for him to be. Commissioner Fabian set a new hearing date for the offender at September 19th, 2011. And in that letter she wrote, "As you know, the release process for life-sentenced inmates occurs over increments and is a long journey of demonstrating and testing living changes. We want to commend you for what you have done over the last 10 years of your imprisonment and remain confident that you will continue to make the same good choices over the continuance period." And that is up to the September 19th, 2011 hearing. In our review of offender Eling in September, we did in fact find that he demonstrated that he had conformed to all the expectations of prison life, that he had taken advantage of all of the opportunities available to him, and we determined that those 5 years were basically without incident. I am always uncomfortable with putting up somebody, especially an offender, as a model for other offenders. That word model offender is something that is, it can be interpreted different ways. I would much prefer that he was a fully compliant offender in every regard. At that time, these facts, his performance during those 5 years, the fact that he had achieved basically 29 years of retribution time with input from the victim, individual staff, individual members of the community, community organizations, along with input from the Life Review Board, we felt clearly at that time that he had met the legal conditions for parole from his life sentence. This allowed him not to hit the streets, but to begin serving the balance of a 108-month conspiracy to smuggle drugs, which he has after credit for time served, and as a result of sentencing guidelines, he has about another 4 years to do in prison before he will transition into a community supervision plan. So he is not hitting the streets. If he is, and this of course means that during the next 4 years he has to absolutely abide by all the conditions in prison as well as the conditions of his new sentence. If at any time during the next 4 years he violates any terms, has any discipline in prison, the life parole is off the table. The stakes are very high for Mr. Eling. If he does comply with all of these conditions, his release date will be December 15th, 2015. But that doesn't end the control that I have as the commissioner. That control continues into the community, into halfway house situations. It can continue into transitional programming back into the community. He'll be under the authority of a parole officer wherever he is, and that parole will be serious. It will be have serious conditions that he must follow. And if, in fact, he violates any of those conditions, he, again, will be subject to violation of a parole condition and the sentence for conspiracy. So he could do the balance of that time as well. There is a tremendous amount of sanction available to us at this point for this offender. The other, Mr. Chair, the other case that you brought up involved, and in your letter you referenced offender Scruggs. That case, when I became commissioner, was well along into this process that I just described. Commissioner Fabian, at her last hearing with Mr. Scruggs, set the course for his release. She set the condition that allowed for parole if he had no discipline violations while he was on work release. And work release is typically the last sanction that an offender has before he is released into the community. She felt that if, in fact, he completed that work release satisfactorily, that there would be no need for a future hearing, that could be an administrative review. That ended up on my desk as an administrative case. The question was asked, did he conform to all the requirements of work release? Are there any other issues that have been brought forward regarding his release? And the answer was no, he is ready. He has completed his work release obligation, and he is now under supervision in the community with our parole officers. Since my tenure as commissioner, I have reviewed 22 life sentence cases with the assistance of my life sentence review board. Of those 22, I have allowed 2 parole decisions by the previous Commissioner Fabian to go ahead. I have paroled 2 others, including Mr. Eling, on life sentences to go on to their consecutive sentences. The other offender that I allowed to go out to continue, not go out, but to start his consecutive sentence was offender Thiemann. At the time of the hearing, he was 78 years old, and he has approximately another 6 years to do on a consecutive sentence. Others, the other cases of the 22 have either been denied for parole. Their cases have been continued for further review, for completion of conditions, but they remain in prison as well. So the only 2 cases of previous Commissioner Fabian are the only ones that have been released to the streets. As we look to the future, these offenders will provide a challenge for us. These 150 that I described are remnants of an old sentencing strategy, the indeterminate sentencing that existed before sentencing guidelines came into effect. These were the cases that in the old days, when I started, judges would sentence people to 0 to 5, 0 to 10. Lifers had the 17-year minimum. That changed significantly with the imposition of sentencing guidelines. Now we have what's called a determinate sentencing structure. So the burden of decision-making is not on a board or a commissioner. It is in statute, and it is specific for specific crimes, exactly how much time they will do. Part of the statutory change that affects this population, of course, has been there are a group of crimes that require life without parole. These are the most serious of the serious cases, of course, and we have 93 of those in our facilities right now. But the growing number, and life sentences as a nation are growing exponentially. The Get Tough on Crime, the 3 strikes are outlaws, have all expanded the life sentence for many, many individuals. In preparation for this hearing, I was looking at statistics, and a statistic that was rather startling to me is that in Pennsylvania, there are 259 juveniles doing life without parole. An incredible number. And that is a nationwide trend. I think there are about 42,000 in the country right now serving life sentences. The impact on facilities can be significant because obviously offenders that are sentenced to life sentences can do 20, 30, and life. The management of those offenders who have nothing to lose is significant. The violence can be significant. Management and the programming for those offenders to keep them busy, the motivation for them to, in prison, to stay crime-free is a significant issue for prison management. We aren't going to solve that or get into that discussion today, but with over 500 lifers, you can see that this is a pretty significant population. And quite frankly, though, this is what prisons should be. Prisons should be reserved for the most serious offenders we have in our state.
Commissioner? I just hate to interrupt you. Just real quickly, I wanted to find out before we pass it by, the lifers you talked about, the juveniles, were they life sentences with a chance of parole or life without parole, the 250 you talked?
You know, that Pennsylvania statistic wasn't real clear on that, and I can certainly get you the document that I was referring to.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we have, I believe, 2 juveniles right now serving consecutive life sentences in Minnesota. One that was in the press very recently, of course, that we received this week, and and another case from about 3 years ago. Anytime a life sentence is reviewed, the emotions, the outrages of the acts come to life again. The trauma to the victims is renewed. Some of these parole hearings under previous commissioners, there's been 5, 6, 7 parole hearings. Each time the victims are notified of those parole hearings, each time they have to face their feelings, their harm, their loss. And it is painstaking for them. It also brings out the outrages of the community. These murder cases, there is not one that hasn't outraged me as a commissioner. They are dastardly deeds done by dastardly people. It is, I mentioned before that these are dark days in my job to review these cases. I don't wish this duty on anybody. It is terrible, terrible duty, but it is important work. We recognize as a department, as an executive branch, that this is the work we have to do. We are proud that we, at least in my administration, I'm going to administer this duty as fairly as I possibly can in compliance with the law. I am not the sentencing judge. I cannot revisit the sentencing issues or the appropriateness of the statutes that these people were sentenced under. That is not my duty. My duty is to execute the law as fairly as I possibly can, with all the input that is required of me, that it be given to me, all the diligence I can possibly give these cases. It is a burden that I've described it as the heavy lifting. I can't imagine the heavy lifting that those families have gone through in these terrible, terrible cases. Saying that, however, I'm destined, and it is the reason I'm sitting here today, is that I do have a belief that people can change. And I've said these words in this chamber before. I've said it upstairs before. I've said it to the governor when he appointed me, that I wouldn't be in this business if I had the belief that every person that came in front of me as an offender was going to be exactly the way they were the moment I met them. I have hundreds and hundreds of staff that go into prisons every day. I should say thousands of corrections employees that go into our prisons every day with the notion that they can make a difference in the lives of others. We have that obligation to at least try. I am not going to sit here and express some naivete about if we're going to get to everybody. Clearly, there are people that don't want to change. I can walk through prisons and there's one, there's one, there's one. I mean, it's clear that they have chosen a life of crime. Those are the people that prisons are for. But I think we have an obligation as a society. I feel strongly as commissioner I have an obligation to promote change, to offer change. If they take advantage of it, great. I think that's what citizens of this state expect. Even the worst of the worst. And you have seen, you have heard, you have read about the worst of the worst. Clearly, the individuals that we have talked about would fall into that category. And it is an amazing process. And sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it takes an influential mentor. Sometimes it takes treatment. But some serious offenders get their lives in order. Some people have said, well, how do you know? How do you know that it's sincere? How do you know that they really have taken these changes to heart? We live with these offenders. The offenders that we talked about earlier, for 30 years, close to 30 years, we have lived with these individuals. Every day, 365 days a year, day and night, multiple times during the day, in treatment, in school, in their interactions, we observe. And this isn't months of observation, this is decades of observation. There are people sitting behind me who have gone into the historical mode in their careers. And they have said, you know, I remember when he came in 30 years ago. I remember what he was like. And they also have recognized the change. These are not bleeding heart liberal corrections people. These are hard-nosed corrections officers. These are hard-nosed corrections administrators, people that aren't likely to have a lot of flowery words for offenders. But in the case of Mr. Eling especially, they have noted that as a sincere, heartfelt, and soulful change. I am really disappointed that an offender of this caliber has received such attention. I was very disappointed to see his picture on the front page and the victim's family on the back page. That was very disturbing to me. These offenders should not get public notoriety. It is wrong. On the other hand, they have done their time. They're eligible. They have due process available to them, and they have the Constitution and the law that requires us as corrections officials to do our duties as well. I need to tell you that behind me I have some staff that may add to and assist you in this discussion. My Deputy Commissioner David Christ is one of the persons I brought with me who has had a long career as warden in different facilities. He sits on the review panel with me. Our legal counsel, Brent Wartner, is also here. He has extensive knowledge about the statutorial changes that occurred with sentencing. He has been sitting on these panels and has probably reviewed on a panel 200 to 300 of these cases over the years. He has served under prior commissioners as well. And we also have other staff who can certainly add to this. Probably the prime figure in this is the executive officer of our Hearings and Release Unit, Jeffrey Peterson, who is the manager, so to speak, of these cases. He brings the information together, he forms the panel, and he has a long history with this activity. And I would offer those three individuals, if they raise their hands, if they haven't already, so you know who they are. Mr. Chair and committee, I want to assure you that we are here to assist you in your inquiry. This is an open process. It is the important work that government does, and it is so serious that, and I'm so appreciative that you have taken the time to make this inquiry. Thank you.
Commissioner, before we bring anybody else up, I've got a question, and sometimes chairs hog the time here, so I just want to ask one and pass it around here, but it's kind of an involved question. And my problem is that, you know, you come from a corrections background, and if one of your correctional officers was executed or shot in the head, you know, I imagine you'd have to take it somewhat the same way, but this is, you know, killed one of my own, and that's why my passion comes from this. And I'm thinking that where we are different in our thought process, if this person would have passed all the litmus tests and been the model prisoner, would have mentored other prisoners and gotten rave reviews, and even if I was convinced he was rehabilitated, I would still rather see him sit his life in prison. And the fact that he has cancer, I'm sorry, but brings no sorrow to me. So the advantage that he's got is, without trying to make this too dramatic, when you say get his life in order, that's his advantage. He'll get out. He'll get his life in order. He'll have his family around him and get his life in order and say his goodbyes. But the cop was shot in the head and didn't get a chance to come home at the end of his shift and say goodbyes and get his life in order, get his will in order to say goodbye to everybody. And so the problem I have is one of your criteria is you consider, it's in our packet, as the severity of the crime. And what I'm wondering is trying to put you on the spot, is there any severe crime that you would not parole? Because I see these at the top of the severity list. If you're going to parole somebody, is there anybody you would not parole? In other words, one of the cop was shot in the head, and the other guy hires somebody to kill a teenage girl. So is there any crime that you wouldn't, well, how high does your severity index go? That's what worries me about the future and the 150 people coming up. Is anybody done a severe enough crime that you're not going to parole them? And I believe that you do have the authority, as you stated. You've stated correctly, you have the authority. And if Commissioner Fabian was here, to tell you the truth, I'd have her up here too, if she would let one of these folks go. So that's my question, is, and my concern for the future is, what is your severity index personally when you're making this decision? What is a severe enough crime to say you're done, you're staying here forever?
Mr. Chair, I probably didn't make myself clear that I do not have the authority to impose a more severe sentence than what was imposed by the court or guided by the promulgated rules. That is my reference point. Clearly, the legislature in 1993 created another threshold of murderers, and that was murderers of police officers and corrections officers. I am controlled by those statutes. My job as commissioner is to execute those statutes and the laws of Minnesota. There are, of these lifers that we have in, there are many of those guys who probably will never see, because of their conduct in the prison, their attitude, their compliance with conditions. I would not support release for those people. And I have already made that decision on any number of them. There, of course, was another police murder case that came to my review. He was not released. He was continued for 3 years. We have continued work to do with that individual. So it is the question of threshold is really the question for you folks as legislators, what you direct me. I was once one of those corrections officers that would have been covered by the statute. I walked into many houses as a parole officer that I wondered if I was going to come out. I know the risks out there. It is, and the feelings of brother officers that are behind me right now, I get it. I absolutely get it. But I am controlled not by public opinion. I am not controlled by the emotions. I have to be controlled by statute and what is allowed under statute and how parole is arrived at. And as hard as that is some days, and believe me, when I leave those hearings, I am drained. It is, and I don't need to expand on that, but I get it.
Bottom line, though, Commissioner, is you could have locked this guy up for life, right?
I could not have.
No, I mean, you could have not paroled. You could have made a decision to...
Given, I would have abused my discretion. I would have abused my authority had I done that. Because he has demonstrated he has met the conditions of parole.
So you could not have denied parole if you wanted to, are you saying?
I would have had to abandon statute. I would have had to abandon my professional ethic to do that.
Representative Creasel first, and then Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, on the back of this paroled lifers form is a list of people that have been paroled. I'm curious to know how many of these people reoffended, if any.
I believe Mr. Peterson has detailed some of those statistics, and if I could ask that he come forward and assist me in this. I know what you're getting at, and if I can expand on that, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner, go ahead.
The recidivism rate for murders of any offender group is the lowest offender group that exists. A recent study of New York paroled murderers between 1985 and 2003, 1.6 were returned to prison within 3 years, none of those for crimes of violence. Murderers have a lot to lose. As a parole officer in my past, supervision of parole of murderers is it's relatively easy. I'm not saying they were without problems, but they comply because they know the stakes are very high. This is Jeffrey Peterson.
State your name and title.
My name is Jeffrey Peterson. I'm the Executive Officer of Hearings and Release for the Department of Corrections. So thank you for the opportunity to address that issue. I did not put together, in relation to the list that you're looking at, those that have gone out and committed new offenses. But in general, what I can tell you is that on occasion there'll be minor offenses, misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors, and which will require a revocation hearing. Some have been returned and re-released. But in my experience over the 15 years I've been here and the historical record regarding the release of life sentence offenders, in my belief, there's been nobody in the state of Minnesota that has ever gone out and recommitted a similar offense, such as they did to cause their life sentence. There is some, like I said, there are those that, again, having been in prison for the number of years, the adjustment situation at the time of parole can be difficult. So there are sometimes some technical violations which we deal with, but nothing in relation to anything in relation to the seriousness of the crime that they committed initially.
Representative Creasel? Do you have any? Okay. Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Roy, I would reiterate what the Chair started us off with this morning, which is that I think this committee has found you to be a very fair, honest man, and we have enjoyed working with you, and I think you have done your job as Commissioner very well.
Thank you.
I would like to say, though, I was a little surprised by your comment that you felt that you didn't have the authority to not parole this individual. And I want to just bring a few quotes from the Star Tribune article from October 30th and get your comments on those. One of them was from Detective Wright. When he was arrested, when Mr. Eling was arrested, Detective Wright said he looked at me and said, "You know, I wish I could have killed you then because I wouldn't be here now." And then after he had, Mr. Eling had served some time, and he was asked about whether or not he understands the disgust felt by police, he said, "I'd probably feel the same way. The record speaks for itself. I have not been a good person in this life." And then finally he said, asked whether he deserved to be paroled after killing an Oakdale police officer. He said, "Probably not. That's a decision that other people have to make." So I do understand the weight of this decision upon you, and I certainly commend you for having to do that and taking on this responsibility. But having said that, I'd like to know a little bit more about what has happened in the 15 years since he was last convicted of a crime while he was in prison when he was involved in some drug smuggling activity. What in the last 15 years has convinced you that these statements that he has made, the statements of Detective Wright, the heinous crime that he committed has now been restored, that he now should be free to walk among us, even if it's under pretty stringent parole requirements? But what are the details behind the last 15 years that led you to believe this is the right thing? And when you talk about that, if you can also elaborate on who you consult with when you make that decision. Did you talk to the governor? Did you, the parole board, and all those things would be very interesting to me.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Commissioner, go ahead.
That is an all-encompassing question. Let me go to the consultation first. The people that sit with me during this decision-making process all have long experience that I've already talked about in corrections. They have observed Mr. Eling. The documents that we review from caseworker, prison staff, discipline staff, treatment staff, all are included in those documents. It is a detailed history of his treatment and his performance in prison. We have, in other cases, seen things as minor as this offender gave his earbud listening devices to another offender. I mean, it gets really to the minutia of their activities in prison. The credibility of an offender is in large part based on the experience of corrections people who see offenders that aren't credible. They have a comparison group. They, again, interact with these offenders every day in a prison situation, every day. After 15 years, and you mentioned the conspiracy case, that really was a turning point for Mr. Eling. He saw the seriousness of that activity. He basically forfeited his previous prison time. He started over, basically, and is still not done with that sanction. And he has a long ways to go yet. So the credibility of an offender, the people that I talk to, it gets down to a real simple question sometimes. And I ask this to numerous people that have worked with him: is he the real deal? Is he really what I'm looking at? And the response has been, yes, he's as good as it gets coming out of this background. There is absolutely no question that his first 15 years, his whole life was terrible. I mean, everybody agrees to that. He says that, and that's why he made those comments, and he made those comments to me eyeball to eyeball. I don't deserve this. I was a bad man, but I'm not that man now. I am not going to feel sorry for him. I'm not going to pose him as a poster child for rehabilitation. Again, he is an offender who has complied with the conditions of his confinement. Regarding the governor, I did not have specific conversations with the governor. I have not had specific conversations with the governor about any of these offenders. He has hired me to do this work. The state of Minnesota has hired me to do this work. In my conversations with the governor, however, I will tell you that I told him I was doing serious work with serious individuals, and that the stakes are very, very high for the work I'm doing. And at that point, he did express confidence. He said the words, "This is why I've hired you. This is what the job you're supposed to do." He did advise me to do it right, however. And
Any follow-up?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that's good advice from the governor, so I think you will heed that advice. Just as a quick follow-up to that, I think most people on this committee are understanding of restorative justice, and I'm sure we're going to hear some testimony on that, and what it takes for somebody to pay their debt to society, and when are they what we would consider safe to walk among us, or paid their debt to society. And I think a lot of times when we talk about that, we're talking about a lot less serious offenses when it comes to drug crimes or theft crimes, those kinds of things, where we can understand that you may have crossed a line and there's a way to restore that. I think there are many Minnesotans and many members of the committee that kind of wonder whether you can ever restore what he has done. And so, I think that's more of a comment than a question, possibly. But your thoughts on that would be good to hear. I know the chair kind of brought that up when he was talking about what sort of prisoner would not be eligible for parole in your mind. But do you believe that no matter what the crime, there is some restoration that it can occur and would result in a parole?
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, I do believe that redemption is possible while you are on this earth. Redemption is sometimes put out as a religious term. I'm using it not as a religious term, but as a belief that is core to me. As I said earlier, I would not be in this work if I didn't believe that even serious offenders, people with serious problems in their life, can redeem themselves. Now, redemption isn't the same as forgiveness. These individuals should never, ever be forgiven. No way, no how. But they can establish themselves, sometimes in prison. Sometimes they experience redemption into that environment. Some of these folks will end up back on the streets. And this notion is something that I have witnessed. I mean, this isn't a textbook arrival for me. I have seen dastardly individuals turn their lives around. I had an individual that shot, in my previous life as a probation parole officer, shot his significant other in her face over in a domestic abuse situation, blew half her face off while she was recovering, and then he shot himself to make it look like it was a home invasion. While they were in the hospital recovering, now, I'm not going to get into details because it's disturbing. 25 years later, I get a call from this individual. He is now the father of 2 children. He wanted to tell me about his college-age daughter who was playing in a basketball tournament. I hadn't heard from him in 25 years. I've worked with individuals in the corrections field who have recovered from alcoholism, drug addiction, have done time themselves, who are now redeeming, restoring. Some people will never get to that point. I know that. But for those that do get to that point, what a shame it would be if we didn't acknowledge it. Sometimes that acknowledgement is in a parole. Sometimes it is you get to continue your life in prison.
Just a second. Before we go to your comment, and Representative Gruenhagen, Johnson, and Gauthier, Commissioner, something that really worries me, you said when you answer you gave me, and we're going to have to check into it, the AG's office, is that if you're saying that you had to release and you were bound to statutorily and ethically, then that does worry me, because when we came into this hearing, I had no problem with you having the authority. It was just questioning how you used it, the decision you made. But if you're saying at that point in time you had to release them, then we do need a legislative fix, because if we've cut the legs out from under Commissioner in every form that comes across, you're going to release these guys without any authority. That really bothers me. So you said that you were bound to release him by statute. When I look at the statute, it's guidelines and it's criteria and it's subjective, and you make the decision.
Yes.
Now, are you telling me that you could not have released him? You were bound by statute, that you had no choice as Commissioner to hold that person?
No, that's, Mr. Chair, that's not exact what I was saying at all.
Okay.
I was saying that if an offender meets the criteria that establishes himself from the previous hearing on, meets all the directions of the Commissioner in performance, in behavior, discipline, treatment, whatever those might be, case by case, I cannot not recognize that performance. The parole system is built on that premise. If, in fact, the state of Minnesota decided 30, 40 years ago not to have a parole system, we would not be sitting here. But this clearly, I have discretion, and if, in fact, an offender performs poorly in prison, clearly my discretion is to say, no way, you're not getting out. But for those that do perform, the presumption is parole. And I think there's case law, and I think there is direction, past practice, and a sense of fairness.
I guess it's the Commissioner. We disagree, because one of the criteria is the welfare of society. So the subjective part would be, if I was Commissioner and I looked at this guy's record and saw about the problems that he's had, and it's my experience in life and knowing how prisoners get religion when they want to get something. When I was jailer, you'd be surprised at how many people went to chapel. They really didn't care about chapel, but they got out of their cell. And so I guess what I'm saying, I look at the subjective part where I see somebody else looking at this might have held them in, regardless of what Commissioner Fabian or whatever she set out. It still comes into your mind at that last trigger point before you sign the letter, that the welfare of society, and so that's the subjective part I guess I'm getting at. And so we're probably cutting hairs here, but I still think that you got the power to slam the door on this guy. Representative Grun. Oh, sir, did you want to say something?
No, that's okay. We can go on.
Okay, Representative Gruenhagen, Johnson, Gauthier, and Mullery in that order. And
Mr. Chairman,
what's that?
can I just to that point?
Sure, go ahead.
That you were, and I'll drop way to the back on the rest of it.
That's okay. Representative Mullery.
Is it not correct, and maybe we hopefully have some legal scholars here, but I would think that if he stated in such and such a case, I would not let them out, I'm looking at liability for the state then from anybody that comes up in front of him and gets denied in the future. It seems to me that that would be the case. Now, is that, am I wrong on that? I think I am correct, because I've talked to criminal attorneys about that.
Yeah, Representative Mullery, I would know. I imagine could be 50 different things that you consider that you could probably worry about. I don't know if you'd be setting precedent that every case is different. Better minds than me, legal minds, could answer that, I guess. Sir, go ahead.
If I may answer that question, Chair. We're challenged all the time by those that we do not release for the reasons the Commissioner has stated, because they have not performed up to the expectations that we have. We currently have a large lawsuit going on right now regarding 5 life sentence inmates who we have denied. And the challenge there is that, Commissioner, you are obligated to release these people because of the law they were sentenced under. And, of course, our response is, but they have not performed up to expectations, and I do have the discretion to keep them in. So as our Commissioner has said, for those that have demonstrated a changed behavior over a long period of time and have followed every directive that we have given, have stayed discipline-free, have not violated any rules. What we're saying is that based on the crime alone is not an argument that we can put forth to keep them in prison because of the statute they were sentenced under, and we are challenged on those and are currently under challenge on those. So just a piece of clarification.
As we are in every form of government, we'll get 100 more lawsuits from prisoners. That's what some of them do for a living and become legal lawyers while they're there. And we're under the same threat with the sex offender program. We get threatened with that. I think the state realizes that no matter what we do, we're going to get sued. So I guess that's not a heavy weight in my mind if we're going to get sued, because I think we are even when we do it right. But Representative Gruenhagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Roy. I would echo previous comments. I've gotten to know you both here in personal testimony or in committee testimony and visiting with you personally. I find you to be an honorable man, caring very greatly about your responsibilities and the safety of the public. However, there's a couple areas that I'd have a little bit of probably disagreement with you. You know, I guess personally I agree with the determinate sentencing. I'm glad we've moved that direction. I think when we look at the will of the public is fed up with criminals who do terrible acts and then wind up back on the street down the road, okay? And they're tired of it. They want these people locked up. You know, and you talked about change. I agree people can change. But when you do certain types of actions, regardless of change, the consequence should not be removed. And what I mean by that is when you kill another person intentionally and deliberately, especially a police officer or any person actually, their family and loved ones carry that consequence for the rest of their life, okay? And yet the person inflicting this on them has the opportunity to demonstrate so-called change, okay, and be back out on the street down the road. Now, we've moved away from that. I understand these 150 people coming up, though, are still under that older law, correct, Commissioner? Okay. I find myself agreeing with the executive director of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, calling for a return to capital punishment for certain types of heinous crimes. And, of course, one of those would be killing a police officer. So I think we need to seriously consider returning to that. My question for you is, if a bill like that was brought forward, would you support the return of capital punishment to the state of Minnesota?
Mr. Commissioner, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, that question is a soul-searching question. Many of my contemporaries around the country that are in my position are death penalty states. I do not share the concept that the death penalty is necessary in the state of Minnesota.
Let me just follow up on that.
Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Commissioner, I personally do support that. And by the way, I spent 13 years on a voluntary basis in jail ministry trying to help prisoners make that change in their life, okay? So I've taken my own personal time out of my life and away from my family on a regular basis trying to help these people. But when you sit across the table from certain people who have done terrible crimes, and I've sat across the table from some of them too under different circumstances than you, they need to have the consequence of their actions. So when I look at your situation, number one, I'm hoping that Chairman Cornish's comments are accurate, that you do have that discretion and we haven't undercut you with statutes and laws. And if we have, then we need to change that. I'd be strongly supportive of that. Number two, I would greatly urge you to err on the side of public safety, okay? I know people can demonstrate change. You know, one example of when I started this prison ministry, or started participating in the prison ministry, I was so excited to see how many prisoners at the table wanted to make a change. I ran into a prosecuting attorney a few weeks later, and I told him of the encouraging response I had had in the prison ministry. And his response to me was, Glenn, when they're in prison, they're all Christians. It's when we let them back out on the street that we got a problem, okay? So, you know, there's a lot of effort to try to act and behave a certain way in order to gain something. But once they've gained that, then they're back out on the street and can endanger the public. Again, I'd just like to reemphasize, you say when these people have changed, have they done any restorative actions towards the people that suffered a loss from their criminal behavior? Or it's just they've started behaving decently inside the prison walls? Could you respond to that at all?
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative Gruenhagen, the engagement of victims with these types of offenders is the victim's choice. Some victims want absolutely nothing to do with these offenders or contact with them into the future. Some offenders have written and dealt with victim issues within their treatment, and as a part of that treatment have written lengthy apology letters that are posted, and if in fact a victim wants to review those, they certainly can, but that we're very sensitive to that re-victimization issue. A person like Don Strufert, some of you folks know that he lost a daughter, murder, rape, and he's a psychologist in Duluth, has done a lot of work in this kind of restorative work with victims, and he himself has had contact with the perpetrator that killed his daughter, and he has found that to be something that has helped him in dealing with his loss. Other victims, and we always offer it, and we never force it. But this particular offender that we were talking about today has, in fact, founded the Restorative Justice Offenders Council within Stillwater. He's doing work with other younger lifers who have not come to the point of really getting it. But that kind of restoration work is done with the help of our staff, of course. But it is really it's a very personal decision that victims have to come to, and we've gotten a variety of responses on that. Thank you.
Any more?
Mr. Chair,
Follow-up?
just one quick follow-up, and I know time is of the essence here. Keep it brief. Yeah, to me, I understand victims not wanting to be associated in any way with their perpetrator or the criminal. I can understand, especially in a heinous crime situation. However, the criminal himself should demonstrate a sincere effort to try to do some type of restorative behavior to the victim, and on a continual basis, not just a month or 2 months, but year after year after year. If I had done that, something like that to someone else, okay, for whatever reason, if I truly was sorry and wanted forgiveness and so-called redemption, then that act that I did would be a continual burden on me until I was able to do some type of thing, even if the victim resisted it, and if they did, fine, but I should still have that type of an attitude. Finally, again, I'd just like to reiterate, and this is an area of disagreement, people can show redemption or forgiveness or whatever, and I'm for forgiveness and redemption, but that does not eliminate the consequence of that behavior. And when you eliminate somebody else's loved one or family member, okay, they live with that consequence the rest of their life. And to put that type of person, even though they're sorry and demonstrated good behavior, back on the street again, is a sword in the heart of the loved ones who've experienced that loss. Please err on the side of public safety and on the rights of the victim over putting people back on the street who've committed acts that eliminate their right to freedom. Not forgiveness or redemption, but freedom. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Commissioner, any response, or should we go to the next one? I'm glad to hear from you.
I think you have Mr. Chair, I think you have a feel for my positions on this issue, and it is 150 bodies that somebody in some capacity into the future will have to deal with. And I'm glad that you have sought the information on this issue.
Okay, Representative Johnson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, I just want to put into context, I guess, or make sure I understand these numbers on this sheet just briefly. When I look at it, it appears that over the last 10 years, 3 different commissioners have authorized the release of 20 different murder one folks that were convicted of murder one. Am I understanding that correct? That 3 different commissioners
That is correct.
done this over the last 10 years, 20 different. So that gives some context to me of the decisions that you're making at this time. This isn't a new incident or a new event that we're dealing with right now. It's something that has been ongoing in light of the laws that were in effect for 89 and that you're going to have to continue to deal with. Is that true?
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnson, yes, that is true. And again, those 150 offenders are at various stages in doing time. So this group of individuals will be around for a length of time, and I suggest that I'm going to be long gone when some of these folks get up for parole.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Gauthier and Mullery, and then after Representative Mullery's question, that last question, then we'd like to go to some other testifiers. We've got several from the law enforcement group here and others, I imagine, here. So, Representative Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, according to the sheet, Commissioner Fabian had begun the process on 2 of the 4 that you've agreed to parole. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And earlier, I think you said there was 22 members that people that you looked at, and 18 you rejected. Is that correct?
The rejection, I don't know if I'd use that word, Representative, but continued for hearing. They were not put on a course to freedom. They were not put into a non-custody situation is the best way to say that.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Gauthier.
Commissioner, you know I'm pretty conservative on some of these issues. So my question then is, under the old statute, once we start this review process and the criteria is laid out, and I want to make sure I understood you correctly, once that's laid out and they meet those conditions, there's a presumption that they continue the parole process. Is that correct?
The presumption is based on their success in meeting those criteria. And if, in fact, we put those criteria forth and they meet them, the response has to, or should be, that we develop a reasonable release plan. Yes.
Mr. Chair, one more question.
Gauthier.
I want to make clear that, I'm sure everybody around this table has an opinion about what they should have done or you should have done or what they would have done, but you're the commissioner, and I want to say thank you for your work as the commissioner. My question is with Mr. Scruggs or Mr. Eling, if there's a violation of those conditions, then do we remove parole off the table? Is that what I heard you say correctly? Or do we say we're going to review it again and we extend it out? What do we do?
Mr. Chair, Representative, the violations of parole and violations of probation have extensive case law, and there is a procedure for revoking parole that is laid out in law, and we would proceed if a violation is significant enough to start a parole revocation process. We would do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Gauthier. Representative Mullery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to start off with, I totally agree with you that just because somebody is threatening lawsuits from prison, I couldn't care less. But On the other hand, when we would be eliciting a response that might automatically give them the win in that lawsuit, I don't like it. So I'm a little careful. And I guess that I care a lot about this issue because a friend of mine was involved in what I consider maybe the worst murder that I can remember in Minnesota history, and that was a cop named Jerry Hoff in Minneapolis. And there's some really outrageous things done by people who have murdered people, but often they're psychotic or something deranged. This was a intended business decision to kill a cop so that the guy that was trying to get further up in his gang and be the leader of the gang. And my friend actually would have gotten killed, except they got a call. The two of them were cops. They'd worked together a long time, and they got a call, and Jerry Hoff, unfortunately, wasn't done eating yet. And so my friend took off, just ran down to a station a couple blocks away that there was a call to, and while he was gone, his partner was executed for just to advance the guys standing in a gang. And so, but I'm trying to get on the record, we're kind of, and maybe it's not you, but maybe it's some attorney, and if you don't have it today, it seems to me from everything I can find out that we're stuck with the laws and the rules that were in place at the time that they were sentenced or committed the crime. And so, as I recall, Jerry Hoff was killed before 93, I think. So even though I think this is probably the last, I don't know, somebody may know if the murderer is still in prison here or what, but maybe somebody got him, but he's the last one I would want out after what he did. But aren't we aren't we stuck? There's a difference between getting sued a lot, as Representative Cornish talked about. I couldn't care less about that, but when we automatically lose and probably get some penalties against the state for it, aren't we bound by the law and the rules on this that are in effect at the time, and that if you used even what I consider the worst thing, to me, I can't think of a worse one in Minnesota, if that was the sole criterion, it would seem to me that we could end up, or not could end up, we would lose the suit on that. That's what I'm trying to get at, is legalities here today, because we're talking about something we can't change, I believe. And if you don't have the answer, I'd like to get it from somebody.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, clearly I'm not a lawyer, but the words ex post facto, where you can't retro apply a law, is central to some of the constitutional, our United States Constitution. So you're absolutely right. If today we decided that all burglars, including those in the past, would have to do 5 years in prison, we couldn't go out and collect all those burglars and bring them to prison because they've already received their sentence. So you're absolutely right. These 150 offenders that we're talking about are controlled by the statute, the sentencing directives of that time.
Okay. Commissioner, I think we're going to, unless you have any other statements you'd like to make now, you sure can. Otherwise, we're going to move. We want to make sure you give you enough time, because we were given a hard time once for not letting commissioners talk long enough.
I would never give you a hard time on that issue. Mr. Chair, I know there are some very important people behind me that need to be heard, because I know this issue is near and dear to them. And I think I have said what I need to say. Thank you very much.
Before I let you leave, you feel you've been treated here fairly today and not been brought out for a big political exposition by me and gone after personally or anything, or do you feel pretty good about so far what's happened?
I've had great respect for government, I mean, government's been my life, and you folks have demonstrated my confidence. I mean, it's here rather than the newspaper. This is the place where these discussions should happen. So I'm very appreciative of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And then, just a second. Governor Quie, would you like to come up? And then after you're done, we're going to get some law enforcement up here in case you've got to get back on the street. So, Governor, it's a pleasure to have you here. Go ahead and give your name as if you had to, and then begin.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Al Quie, and I've served in both the legislative branch and the executive branch. And when I read this article in the paper, it troubled me. And so I asked if I could testify. And there are really three questions that I have. In this case, should the legislature intervene? And the second one, would the police and the public be safer if the parole was not granted 3 years from now? And the last question is, do we have a better system if there was no opportunity or hope for redemption? And so let me address the first one. While I was governor, the legislature, in his wisdom, removed the parole board, and the commissioner had the decision. I was concerned, but not enough to veto the bill at that time. And I talked to my commissioner, and he said that he would like help in that, and he wondered how I would feel if Les Green assisted him. Les Green, African-American man who had been in prison himself. And I said, I know enough about Les Green. I commend you for asking him to help you, because I thought it was good he'd have that perspective. Now, over the years, I have no reason to say that you ought to go back to the parole board, but I think that you may want to look at that. Again, I know Mary Kiffmeyer has, Representative Kiffmeyer tried to do that in the past. And so I think that's, after you have changed, you can look at it. But at this one, I have confidence, as I understand you folks do, with Tom Roy as a commissioner, and that he will use good judgment, and he used good judgment in this case. Now, on the question of the public and the police being safer if we keep them in prison for life, we once had 3 times and you're out in Minnesota. And Commissioner Frank Wood told me that when that was changed, they let 150 prisoners out. And not one of them recidivated. Not one of them committed a crime afterwards. Now, having one person who in 3 years is going to come out is a lot different than dumping 150 out onto the street. And that did affect my thinking when you realize that. I mean, why in the world keep them in prison during that time? And then the last part on redemption. I just want to share with you that on the last hearing of the Pardon Board, in which the Attorney General and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Governor said, people came in urging the pardon of an individual who had killed his father and his mother and his oldest sister. And we did not do that. He'd been in prison for 7 years. But his wife came to me afterwards and asked if I would go and mentor him. So I mentored him for 13 years while he was in prison, and then afterwards. Afterwards, he was put in, he had a home in North Minneapolis. So I don't know if it's your district or Bobby Champion's district, but the people were upset that such a person would be up there, and they got a petition together to deny him the right to be there. But, you know, they couldn't buck the government at what they had said. Now, over a period of time, and he had the electronic bracelet on, and he could go and work, and he was home and everything like that. About 2 years later, he gave me a call. He was excited. The man who organized the petition against him had called him, and he said his wife was working, and he had to run an errand, and he had just about a 2-year-old boy, and he asked if Gary would take care of his little son. And he said, that's his most prized possession. I've been forgiven. And 3 times he said that and yelled. And I tell you that story, that the idea of forgiveness and redemption is awesome for a person. And remember that somewhat times we take a chance, but I think it's worth taking a chance. Now, in the whole area of forgiveness, it's very difficult to understand the family of the deceased person, whether it's a policeman or not. But this happened in my family. A man raped her, and in order to prevent her from identifying him if she afterwards, with an ice pick, he stabbed her in the chest and the heart. And then in case she still lived, he stabbed her in the eyeballs so she couldn't identify him. But stabbing her in the chest with the ribs dulled the point enough so it glanced off the eyeballs every time. When I was governor, I made certain I never saw him when I visited any of the institutions. But when I became the director of prison fellowship and went to Oak Park Heights, the chaplain told me he wanted to see me. I didn't want to see him. But I said, would it do any good? And he said, it's up to you. You can have my office. So he sat down in front of me as close as this camera here is to me. And he said, I watch you on television. I just want to ask you, would you ever forgive me? And it just came to me. I'd had to forgive him. So I said, I think it behooves a person of whom forgiveness is requested to respond. And I said, I forgive you. And he broke down and sobbed at least 3 minutes. And then he lifted his head up and he said, could I give you a hug? And we hugged each other there. Then went out, because I went there to visit a Bible study that was being held in Oak Park Heights. We sat by each other like brothers. If that hadn't happened, and he was in the room, I would have had that same feeling about him, what he had done. Folks, there's something important in redemption that I ask you not to take that hope away from people who are in prison. And so now, for 40 years, I've been doing this. And I picked the toughest person I can find there to work on. It isn't always successful, but I found that the number one thing is pay attention. Number 2 is absolutely demand integrity. So at the third meeting, I asked them to tell me everything that they did. And if they really don't, I think, give it to me, all of it, I said, we'll keep working on this till you do. And over that time, with what I call accountability and love, I've seen the changes. I just wanted to come here and share that with you. Because you, members of the legislature, have a responsibility here. When something like this comes up, and you hate to have it fanned out in the public, but you have a responsibility to see how the system works. And so far, I say, I think it's working good. I think the Department of Corrections is being very cautious on who they give parole to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Governor. Appreciate it.
If anybody wants any questions, yeah. Representative Grunewald.
Okay, well, we've got to get another guy testifying out here real quick.
Short question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor Quie.
Yes.
And you know I greatly respect you. We've talked before.
Yeah.
We both participated in prison ministry, and I applaud you for that because it's a commitment and, caring about people that where you could spend time with your family or do other things besides. So I share that common commitment with you. I agree with you completely on redemption and forgiveness. But that does not mean you eliminate the consequence for what that prisoner did to that woman.
That's right.
She carries that the rest of her life. He needs to carry a consequence, or the criminal, for the rest of his life. That is not unloving. It is not uncaring. It doesn't mean you don't practice forgiveness or redemption, but you don't remove that consequence. And for certain consequences of heinous nature, the death penalty is appropriate. That's just my only comment.
Yeah. I won't talk about this because it isn't now, but let's you and I talk about it today.
Sure.
Because it was my biggest struggle. I came down on the other side finally because of this person who had killed his father and his mother, his older sister.
Governor, thank you very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to hear from you.
Chairman.
Next, we'll move into the law enforcement group and begin with the Executive Director of the MPPOA, Minnesota Police and Peace Officers, Dennis Flaherty. Mr. Flaherty, if you come to the stand and state your name and title and go ahead and give us your testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Dennis Flaherty, and I'm Executive Director of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, which is a statewide group of rank-and-file police officers employed at all levels of government. And I'm here today to hopefully articulate the position of what I think the overwhelming majority of my members would have on this issue. I got to tell you, first off, I think that as far back as I can remember, at least in recent history, I have received more emails and phone calls from my members around the state about this issue than anything that I can remember. All of them, of course, expressing their shock and their outrage about what has occurred. Now, I must say that many of them started in their careers after 1993, so they have always known only one law, and that is the law that our association advanced over here at that time to call for the harshest punishment that was possible for the intentional killing of a police officer, which was life without parole. And I think all of us naively have thought that took care of the problem, and people that have been convicted of that crime since have gone to prison, and we will not have a situation like this where there will ever be an opportunity for anybody to release them from prison. But I just want to talk just a couple minutes about what the impact of the killing of a police officer has on any community. And I've been around in this business and around it for about 38 years, and I think I have gone to the funerals of most officers that have been killed, who lost their life in the line of duty. And they never get easier, and in fact, the older I get, the harder they are for me to take. Because if you reflect on some that you remember that may have happened in your communities or around you, or you may have known them, they're all very senseless, and they're naturally tragic. And it was said to me one time early on in my police career, and I agree with it, that there's no greater assault that can be perpetrated on a community, the entire community, than the killing of a police officer. I think you see, when it does happen, the outpouring of support, the outpouring of sorrow, the outpouring of anger, that somebody that's charged with protecting them has been killed. It's not only was an assault on the officer and that police department, but it actually was an assault on the entire fabric of that community. Because if a person would kill a police officer, who among us wouldn't they kill? And I think that in 1993, we did not have a difficult time convincing people sitting in your chairs that Minnesota had to have the most harshest penalty for people that took cops' lives. And I think one of the troubling things, and I had the opportunity to speak with Commissioner Roy yesterday and had just a snapshot of what he was going to say today. And I know the decision weighed very heavily on him. That was clear just from the tone of his voice. But it still doesn't mean we agree with the decision. And, of course, I think of the family. I have to. I have to think of the family. And I can't help but think of all the officers that are lined up at all these funerals. And what they're saying is, but for the grace of God go I. Because they know that at any day, at every time they put on that uniform, regardless of where they work, no one is exempt, whether it's a community of 1,000 or a city of 400,000. No police officer is exempt. And so it really is something that they take very, very seriously. I think, I've heard this word about model offender, and I know it's a prison term, and, I respect their lingo. But really, I don't know about you, but that has no significance to me, whether a person has been a model prisoner. If I worked in a prison, I suppose it would have great importance that this person is behaving themselves and complying with all the rules and so forth. But I doubt if you asked any of the 5 children of Officer Walton whether they care that this person was a model prisoner, I don't think it would register. And I'd have to ask, I've asked myself, when was he a model prisoner? Was it the first 15 years, or was it the second 15 years that we're basing this release on? Because if I'm not mistaken, the guy was involved in trafficking drugs, introducing drugs to a correctional facility, which in itself is a pretty serious offense as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm kind of confused about this whole model offender aspect of this. And I'm concerned because, Representative Mullery, you asked a good question about your friend Jerry Hoff. And he was killed September 25, 1992, before we passed this law. So what is going to happen to the person that was responsible for that? What about Officer Richard Miller from your neighborhood in the north side of Minneapolis? Now, it is my understanding that his killer came up for review. I think that's who the commissioner was alluding to when he said another cop killer came up for review in sometime this summer, and it's scheduled or rescheduled, I could say, for 3 years. Are we going to be back discussing this at that time when that person is released? And the list goes on. I looked at the officers killed from in that era, going from like 1980 up to 1993, and we did have officers feloniously killed, and their killers were sent to prison. I'm assuming they're still there, and they're going to be coming up at some point for review because, again, the offense occurred before 1993. So, to me, this system didn't work. It failed in this case. I have to be very honest with you. There's just no way even after listening to Commissioner Roy articulate his position this morning before you, I'm still not a believer. And it failed. I don't know how better to say it. And the police community feels let down, because they are in denial to themselves that this could ever happen. And what I guess concerns me is the closed process that they use. I would think, and I guess I don't know, so I don't want to speak out or speak incorrectly, but what is the process? Do they announce this to the public that they're considering releasing this person? Did the Walton family have an opportunity to come and maybe if Commissioner Roy would have looked in their eyes, maybe it might have resulted in something different. Do they get an opportunity to discuss? After all, there's 5 kids that grew up without the love and guidance of a father. Doesn't that mean anything? And, you know, rehabilitation, really, is that what we're looking for when somebody kills a cop? I'm not sure. If I polled my members, I don't think that would be real high on the list of what they're looking for. I think if we polled citizens at large, I've talked to people, of these calls I've been getting, a number of them actually have been from citizens that I've never met wanting to know what could they do. You know, they're just outraged. They can't believe that this would happen. I received a call from a guy who owned a bar that this guy robbed and was never, and they didn't charge him with it because they were told at the time, this bar owner was told at the time, don't worry, this guy's never going to get out of prison. Are you kidding me? He's killed a cop. And so they didn't charge him with that offense. He came in, robbed the place, tied the owner up, went through the whole deal, and he was told, don't worry about it, because after all, it's a cop killer. This person will never get out of prison. So anyhow, I just want to close by saying that I understand the people that are there for offenses prior to the determinate sentences or prior to certainly the 1993 law, but when it comes to offenders like this, we got to come up with something better. I don't know how we do it, whether corrections does it themselves or you direct them, or I don't know what we really can do, but we were not served well. I don't think the citizens of the state were served well by this decision, and I can assure you the law enforcement community feels that they were not served well at all on this either. So with that, I'll close my remarks, and Mr. Chair, if I can answer any questions, I'd certainly be willing to do so.
Thank you, Director Flaherty. And any questions? I guess we're going to let you go. So thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate it. Next, we'll have Jim Franklin, the Director of the Sheriff's Association, come before us. And if there are any other law enforcement that we haven't got on the list yet, if you want to raise your hand or let me know. All right. Director Franklin. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Jim Franklin, Executive Director for the Minnesota Sheriff's Association. I'm here today to speak on behalf of the 87 elected sheriffs in the state of Minnesota, many of the deputies that they employ, staff that they employ, citizens of the community that they serve. And I think it's fair to say that we, in our capacity as sheriffs, probably work more closely with the Department of Corrections than any other law enforcement agency. It's imperative that we work together, interact together with them on a daily basis when we deal with the inmates that are transferred back and forth between our respective systems. Having said that, one of the things is our ability to work with the corrections staff, the commissioner specifically, and the importance of that position and the relationship to our sheriffs and the working ability on a daily basis between our staffs. Clearly, you've heard testimony here today, and I will not go through and try to belabor the points that my team member, Dennis, has already made. It is an emotional issue. It is an issue that touches all of us. The same law that protects us as law enforcement officers protects correctional officers when they are killed. The presumption is that the majority or many of our officers are hired after 93 and assume that that law covers and no parole for persons who kill an officer. Most of the public believes that. So we have an issue of credibility to some degree in that arena. I think what this really boils down to is a simple issue. I've heard the term, Dennis mentioned it, model inmate, model prisoner, no infractions. I think we disagree with the commissioner on that. We disagree with his staff or whoever was making that decision. We have a difference of opinion, perhaps, and standard that we hold in law enforcement versus what they hold in corrections. We think that the infractions of introductions of drug and trafficking into the institution is a violation. It's not a model prisoner. It's just that he got caught with one. How long would have it continued had it not been caught? Put that all aside. The law enforcement job, we get it. We understand the rules. We understand the technical aspects of the law versus the spirit of the law. And I have been here and testified before this group and other groups about what is the spirit of the law versus the technicality of the law. We get that. Having said that, we as law enforcement are charged with a very difficult task of gathering evidence, good or bad, guilty or innocent. We have a double-edged sword that cuts both ways to prove somebody guilty or somebody innocent. Take that evidence to the prosecution, to the courts. We are not the judge and jury. We get that part. We live with it. We may not like it, but it is part of what we understand. I think where we're frustrated is that we do not agree with the commissioner on the model prisoner. We do not agree with the commissioner in his ability that he has to let this person go. And we don't agree with the fact that law enforcement, in this case, the family of law enforcement, did not have an opportunity to have any input, was not consulted, and perhaps there is no way, in given the current status of how these decisions are made, to have any input. We have been with the Department of Corrections on other issues where we have garnered input. And this may be one of the flaws that we have to look at in this current system of lack of input from our law enforcement standpoint family into the evaluation process here that was conducted by the commissioner. I have the deepest respect for the commissioner. I did call him yesterday. We did have a very good conversation. David, Chris, and I have worked together and will continue to work together. And I feel very comfortable telling both of them exactly where we feel and exactly what we stand. And I think we have a respect for one another. But we certainly have some differences of opinion on these points. And to that end, this may be something that a legislative review or fix needs to occur and have further discussion. I would just close with one thing. We've talked a little bit about the philosophy here of the death penalty and the philosophy of a number of things. I'll just share with you one personal thing that my father told me before I died, and I never forget it, and I think about it every single day. And that was this. He said, remember, you came into this world with nothing. You will leave this world with nothing, but you will be judged by what you did with what you had at some point in the future, not on this earth, but in heaven. And I think about that every day with every action that we take. What is the long-term haul here? And it's a challenge, I think, for each of us, whether we are an inmate inside or whether we sit in this room or outside. What are we doing? What's the long-term goal and gain? And how will that play out on our scorecard in the end? Challenging thing for me to think about. Just share that as a personal note. Thank you. With that, I'll close.
Thank you very much, Director. Appreciate it. Anybody else that would like to testify in the law enforcement category? If not, then what? Oh, law enforcement. What did he say? Oh, okay. Well, if there's nobody in that, go ahead, sir. We had anybody else on the list first? Okay, come on up ahead, and then if anybody else is going to, why don't you get ready so you can just come up right after this gentleman. You want to state your name and any organization, or if you're just a private person, go ahead. I shouldn't say just a private person. I should say a private. That's why we're here, to listen to private.
Chairman and members of this committee, my name is Paul Engwall, for the record spelled E-N-G-W-A-L-L. I live in Prior Lake. I'm here today as a volunteer in the Amicus organization. For anyone who may not know about Amicus, it's a private, not-for-profit organization based in Minneapolis that has the purpose of receiving requests from inmates in state prisons in Minnesota who are requesting someone to be a friend to them, and that's the amicus is the Latin word for friend. They want someone who maybe write letters to them, and if possible, visit them on occasion. I volunteered about 3 years ago now to be an amicus volunteer, and I was matched with Timothy Eling at Stillwater State Prison. I didn't know him, he didn't know me, but this occurred about 3 years ago, and in the 3 years I've had monthly face-to-face conversations with Tim at Stillwater State Prison. I have found him to be a person, given the life experience that he has gone through. I have a degree of high respect for what he has done with his life in the 29 years that he has been in prison. I would like to say that I have found him to be a person who accepted responsibility for his crime, and he accepted the reality that he was in prison, and at the time that I first met him, certainly he didn't know if he would ever come out of the prison. But he accepted responsibility for having taken the life of Officer Richard Walton. He, of course, came into prison as a drug addict, and that, of course, was a primary reason for the crime that he committed. He was addicted to drugs, and so he went to that pharmacy in a hospital, I believe in Washington County, and he and an accomplice, in the course of robbing that pharmacy and receiving drugs there, Officer Walton, who was there as an off-duty security officer in the hospital, was shot and killed by Tim and by his accomplice. There's been a lot of talk here this morning about religious faith and what that means and what it doesn't mean. But I have found Tim to be a person whose life was changed in prison, in part due to the religious faith that he has. I have prayed with Tim in the prison visiting room at Stillwater, and my wife and I pray for him every day at home. I want to return again to how the prison experience has changed him. And at this point, I would say that I think that prisons really can be the environment in which people do change. And Timothy is one of them. He wanted to make the most of the time that he was at Stillwater, whether that was for any X number of years or whether it was for the end of his life. He wanted to make the best use of his time while he was there. And so he immersed himself in the drug addiction treatment program at Stillwater. He had good recovery from addiction himself, and then he remained active in the program. It's called the Phoenix program. It's within the prison complex at Stillwater, and to this day he continues to be involved in leadership in that addiction treatment program, helping other inmates face the reality of their addiction and then hopefully recovering from it. He is a mentor in the restorative justice program there. He also teaches painting. He's quite an accomplished painter, and he teaches a painting class within the prison for other inmates. One of the paintings, a print of which he gave to me, is one of the Twin Towers after 9/11, and he includes Jesus in the background of that painting, looking at the rubble of the destruction of the Twin Towers, together with firefighters and police officers and other people who were there and dealt with that at firsthand. In summary, I do totally support the action of Commissioner Tom Roy. I really don't know what is to be served, what good is to be served by keeping this man incarcerated until the end of his natural life. I really don't understand what will be accomplished by that. And I really, if I could be so presumptuous to do so, I would have to ask all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to think about that yourself. What good is going to be accomplished by holding him there until the day of his natural death? So I guess with these remarks, I'm a citizen. I don't have any professional responsibility for anything. I'm a volunteer. But if anyone wants to ask me any question, I'd be glad to respond to them.
What was your name again, sir? Your last name?
My first name is Paul.
Paul Engwall?
Engwall.
Okay.
Correct.
Paul. I guess I can figure a lot of good reasons why he should stay the rest of his life. First of all, the consequence mentioned, and then if you're going to praise for somebody, it's good to know exactly where they're at. And I would feel a lot more comfortable knowing this guy's in prison for the rest of his natural life. And it's just the commissioner's opinion or mine if he's going to reoffend. And the best cure for recidivism is bars, the only sure thing. And so it comes down to basically a determination of whether he's going to offend or not, I suppose. If you think he's completely rehabilitated and there's no chance to reoffend, then your argument would be that he should be let go. I'm not so convinced that he is. Therefore, I think he should stay there. Plus the consequence. You know, somebody that executes a cop, or there's got to be a certain level of severity where you just say no. You do it, you're going to do the time, no matter how much you whine and cry and say that you're a good boy now. And I think this is, one of those instances. So it's probably just a difference in our backgrounds and how we look at things. And I'm not saying you're wrong for wanting to let him go at all. I just think that he should, serve his rest of his natural life until his death, right where he's at. And I have no problem with forgiveness. I'm a Christian, and I forgive this man totally, and I'll even pray for him. But I think he needs to serve the consequence, for his crime. So,
you may be correct in some of the things that you say, but I think if that became public policy here in Minnesota or anywhere else, we better be ready to build a lot more prisons around the state of Minnesota to house these people if we're going to keep them there for the rest of their lives. And not to speak even of the rather significant cost to the citizens of Minnesota in keeping an inmate incarcerated there for the rest of their lives.
Sir, I agree with you. In fact, some of my DFL counterparts will even agree that I have come to the conclusion you can't lock everybody up and keep them in jail. I totally agree. And
Really?
Yeah. And in fact, there's a very conservative movement called Right on Crime that believes you can't lock everybody up. And I have friends that are advocates for this policy of releasing people. What we're talking about, a cop killer and a gangster that hired somebody to kill a child. There's where I differ. And I don't think we're going to have to build a lot of new prisons for these people because there's not that many cop killers out there that we're going to have to build a wing on a prison. But when it happens, I believe they should be incarcerated for their lifetime with no exceptions. And so we can go tit for tat in this all day. It's just, I don't think you're wrong. It's just, I happen to believe that I'm right. We got a couple more people, and we got to be out of here very soon. So anything else? Sure. I appreciate your testimony and have respect for what you said.
Thank you for allowing me to appear here.
Thank you. And Representatives Kiefer and then Gauthier, and then we're going to close up probably pretty quick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment. Mr. Engwall asked what are we going to accomplish through keeping him in prison, and I think the main thing that I'm concerned about is the societal message. And what we really want to do is deter youngsters who are in gangs to choose this lifestyle. And so when we say the consequence of your action is going to be life imprisonment, and then we change that, it's like crying wolf. And so I think just to answer that quick question, we need to be really thinking about how society as a whole is going to be affected by our policies and long-term consequences. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Kiefer. And Representative Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple points of clarification. I have personal opinions and viewpoints about this, what happened also, but I am not the Commissioner of Corrections. And during the testimony, we heard from law enforcement about model prisoners, and I clearly remember the Commissioner saying he doesn't use that term, that he was compliant to the conditions set forth. And there's a big difference there. And I want to be clear about that. And yes, it is frustrating, and I can imagine the frustration, but I believe the Commissioner has acted under good faith, under the statutes and the laws of the state of Minnesota, and I'm just glad I didn't have to make that decision.
And in conclusion, it is a different system that we have here. Somebody kills somebody, and we give them a gold star for being normal. We send them to prison, and because they act normal, we think that they need to be rewarded for it. And actually, they've killed somebody. Now they're in a confined atmosphere. They're acting normal, and we give them gold stars for not stabbing somebody or dealing drugs. So, that's some of my frustration. But I want to make sure that this was a fair hearing. So, Commissioner, I want to give you the very last word today. If you feel you need to say anything or address anything that hasn't been, and I appreciate you coming here today and being forthright with us about your decision. So. And if there's nothing else, we'll conclude the hearing. Thank you very much.